Let's talk about India's youngest and most infamous serial killer, Amarjeet Sada. He was only 8 years old when he struck. He preyed on children, and his first victim was his sister, who was only 8 months old. Shortly after murdering her, Amarjeet struck again, murdering his 6-month-old cousin. Even more chilling is that the family and villagers knew about these murders but chose to stay silent. They deemed the killings as internal family issues, not realizing that Amarjeet would soon strike and murder someone outside of his family. In 2007, Junjun Devi, the mother of a 6-month-old baby girl, left her daughter at the school daycare to do her chores. When she returned, she found her child was missing. When the news spread, people feared the worst, and since they knew about Amarjeet's past, they confronted him. After being questioned, Amarjeet showed no remorse. He gleefully told the villagers about how he strangled the child to death and then led them to a shallow grave where she was buried. He told them he killed her by beating her with a brick. He then buried her with debris and grass that was around the area and went back home after she was dead. He was arrested for the murder of Khushbu Devi after his confession. Unfortunately, since the family covered up the first 2 murders, Amarjeet wasn't found guilty of them. Despite this, he was questioned about how he attacked his victims and why. Instead of providing these details, he looked at the police, smiled, and asked if they could give him some more biscuits. He showed no remorse, and whenever the police tried to ask him about the crimes, he would stop talking and smile. Superintendent Amit Lodha ordered that the case be looked at from a psychological perspective. Patna-based psychoanalyst Shamshad Hussain looked into the case and found that the child lacked remorse and enjoyed inflicting pain on others, making him a true psychopath. It also seemed that he had a brain issue which led to a chemical imbalance. This in turn led to increased gratification from inflicting pain on others. He was diagnosed with a conduct disorder that was claimed to be hereditary. This led him to commit acts of violence because he had no sense of right or wrong. Amarjeet was tried, and according to India's laws, it's speculated that he was sentenced to serve 3 years in juvenile prison since children can't serve more. It's also speculated that due to his mental state and the extreme threat he posed to society, that he was placed in a mental institution after he served his time. Amarjeet's whereabouts are currently unknown. However, in 2015, he contacted the Postmortem Post. He claimed he was in a children's facility where he would be till he turned 18. Since he would be over 20 now, if his claim is valid, he'd be allowed to leave the facility. It's unclear whether he'll go on to commit more crimes or if he was successfully treated. Some people speculate that Amarjeet wasn't the original culprit and that he was framed for the murders. The nature of the crimes and the elaborate hiding spots were too much to have been committed by an 8-year-old child. Despite this theory, the fact that he was excited to reveal what he did and his reaction when he was questioned, it seems that Amarjeet Sada was in fact India's youngest serial killer. Let's talk about another South Asian serial killer who claimed a whopping 100 lives. Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer who confessed to the murder and sexual abuse of 100 boys ages ranging from 6 to 16. When his father died in 1993, Javed inherited 3 million rupees. He used the money to open different businesses designed to meet young boys and teenagers. He'd lure his victims by leaving money on the floor of his video game arcade. Whenever a child would pick up the money, he would accuse them of theft and take them to a room where he would sexually assault them as their punishment for stealing. Javed also met other victims through pen pal programs. He'd convince them to send photos of themselves, select his favorites, and then he'd send them gifts. After that, he'd arrange to meet them and sexually assault them. He'd abduct his victims, assault them, and then strangle them to death. He'd then dismember the corpses of his victims and submerge them in vats of hydrochloric acid. After the bodies liquefied, he'd dump everything into a nearby river. In 1998, Javed and an employee were robbed and beaten by another employee. He suffered a severe head injury and was hospitalized for 22 days. Right after that, he was arrested and charged with sexual assault. Somehow, he was granted bail and most of his property was sold to cover his medical care. He moved out to the slums of Lahore where he would commit more heinous crimes. In 1999, Javed wrote a letter to the police and a local Lahore newspaper where he confessed to the murder of 100 boys. When the police got to his home, they were met with bloodstains, vats of acid containing partially dissolved bodies, and plastic bags containing the clothes and shoes of his victims. Note cards with details and photos of his victims were also found, but Javed was gone. The police also found out he'd been sharing his home with 3 teenage boys who were believed to be his accomplices. On December 30th, 1999, Javed gave himself up. However, when it came time for him to stand trial, he denied any involvement in the killings. He claimed he confessed to the murders to draw attention to the dangers children living in poverty experience. Thankfully, the judge didn't believe him, and he was sentenced to death by strangulation in the same public square he frequented when searching for victims. His body was also to be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid. His 3 accomplices were also found guilty. However, on October 8, 2001, he and one of his accomplices were found dead in their cell. It seems like they had committed suicide. However, there's speculation that they were murdered because autopsies revealed that they were beaten prior to their death. Javed's motive for these murders was his rage over a perceived injustice committed by the Lahore police. They beat him after arresting him on charges of sexual assault against a young runaway boy in the 1990s. Since his mother was forced to watch his decline due to these injuries before suffering a fatal heart attack while he was still incarcerated, he vowed to make 100 mothers cry for their sons just as she had cried for him. Javed bragged to authorities that he could have easily killed 500 or more children. He stopped at 100 because that's what he promised himself. Let's talk about Raman Raghav, a serial killer who terrorized Mumbai in the 60s. Raman confessed to claiming at least 41 lives. With the cover of night, Raman would emerge and hunt anything with a pulse. His targets were those who were homeless. Raman would use a steel rod to bludgeon the faces of his victims till they were reduced to severed heads and broken skulls. From 1965 to 1966, he attacked 19 people along the Central Railway line. Some were bludgeoned to death and others survived to tell the harrowing tale that centered around a scrawny man. An eyewitness who was related to one of the victims reported this matter to the police. A scrawny homeless man who fit the bill named Raman Raghav was arrested. He had a rap sheet and previously spent 5 years in prison for robbery. Since there was no solid evidence against him for this new series of crimes, he was released. In 1968, it seemed that Raman was back to his old ways since bodies started piling up again. Mumbai went into lockdown. The case was handed to the Deputy Commissioner of Police, Ramakant Kulkarni. DCP Kulkarni began looking into the murders and found that they formed a pattern. The victims were being slaughtered close to the jungles. Since earlier the same thing was happening around the Central Railway line, Kulkarni became suspicious of Raman. He started combing through Raman's files and launched a citywide manhunt to bring Raman in for questioning. It was Sub-Inspector Alex Fialho who recognized Raman from the photos in the files. When he searched Raman, he found his belongings consisted of everyday items. His clothing was bloodstained and his shoes were caked with mud. His fingerprints matched those on file, confirming his identity. He was arrested for 2 murders committed in Chinchavli village, Greater Mumbai. For weeks after his arrest, Raman was silent. The police couldn't beat or torture any answers out of him. He finally changed his tune after his requests for chicken dishes to eat were fulfilled. After eating, he invited the officers to ask whatever they wanted. Raman confessed to committing 41 murders. He took the police on a citywide tour to show them where he operated, how he obtained the rod he used to kill his victims, and where he hid it. After initial observation, it was determined that he wasn't suffering from any mental disabilities and was aware of the nature and purpose of his acts. Following this evaluation, Raman went to trial where he pleaded guilty. During the trial, a psychiatrist from Nair Hospital in Mumbai was cited as a defense witness. He claimed he had evidence that Raman suffered from chronic paranoid schizophrenia. He said this meant Raman was unable to understand that his actions were contrary to the law. Still, the judge declared him guilty and sentenced him to death. However, before the sentence was confirmed, the High Court of Mumbai ordered the Surgeon General of Mumbai constitute a board of 3 psychiatrists. This board would determine whether Raman was of unsound mind and incapable of making his defense. He was interviewed by the Special Medical Board 5 times. Throughout the interviews, he showed signs of delusion of persecution and grandeur. After the interviews, his sentence was reduced to life in prison because he was found to be incurably mentally ill. In 1995, Raman Raghav died of kidney failure.